I'll be repotting my Astrophytums since the community pots are getting quite compact and tight in space. I'll just repot it now and leave them for about 2 years. This one still has a bit of space, but I'll be repotting these as well. I'll be selecting approximately 10 of my favorites, just judging on some of the characters. Like this one has a different spotting where it's line pattern, and I'll be selecting the stronger supercubital traits, and I'll be spreading them out to one more planter, and the smaller ones and the excess I'll just pot them up in random pots that I have around, since pretty much everything in my collection will be a community pot. I'm trying to see what goes with what. I'll have some losses, it's fine, but pretty much all the cacti can go with each other, and with some of the seeds that I got as a fan gift, I guess. I don't know how else to describe it. Just offering up some seeds that he had. I'll be doing community pots with the ephedra, the cat. I'm not entirely sure since it's a pretty large bush, but I think I could put it with some cacti as well. And the acacia, like I mentioned, I'll try to do a bonsai with it. I may also try a bonsai with the cat seeds. So, still trying to determine what exactly I'll be putting together and how I'll be setting up the collection, but I'll be working on repotting most of my planters, just so that since there's some die off, I'll fill up the spaces and I'll spread them out a little bit, and they'll get a root trim, and they should be good for another 2 years or so. So as you can see, my substrate is 100% gravel or granite chips, and the root systems are very healthy. They're fine and lots of feeder roots, and I'll be trimming back, leaving just the main taproot. So in the past I did an experiment where I tested leaving the roots intact, and overall there wasn't a massive difference since my experiment scale is pretty small, but I only had around, I think, 6% loss with completely trimming back, and I believe 16 or a bit higher percent losses with leaving the root intact completely. So I'll be trimming these. I will also be saving the roots. In the past I did a very quick and not very detailed extraction of the roots, and I ended up with a red oil that smelled very similar to meat oil. So I assume that there are some properties to it. I didn't get around to testing it. I just noticed the smell, and it was fairly identical to meat oil that we add to boots and stuff to waterproof it and clean it. So it's last I checked, it's some sort of acid. So I'll be saving that and seeing if it has any properties, possibly just to reapply it to these, maybe as a rooting supplement or something. And yeah, I'll show how much I trim back the roots. I'll try filming a few, but it's very simple. I just trim back all of these feeder roots, and I just leave a nub. Oops. I cut back pretty much all of these feeder roots, and I leave just the nubs of the taproot intact. And yeah, I'll try to keep a majority of these. I'll be isolating these that have some rust issues. I'll be keeping them, but they're 100% going into another community pot. I'm not keeping them on their own anymore. But overall, my super cubuto have been very resilient. They've grown well, and they pretty much all started to flower. So if I repot now, they should start to get some roots before winter. They'll slowly grow some more roots since we have a very mild winter, and by spring and summer next year I should still get flowers. And what else? Oh, one more thing. Like I mentioned in the past, what I do is I trim these, I let them air dry for maybe a day or just a few hours, and I place it on top of the substrate. I may make a small indentation just so that it doesn't stay too exposed, and I won't water for a month, but after that I'll just water it as if it had a normal root system. This one came out nice. And yeah, I don't wait until I see roots. I just water them as usual. The top few inches of the substrate dries fairly quickly, and this is extremely porous. It doesn't retain much water. You can see, since I watered last week, there are still some moist rocks, but it's fairly dry to the touch, so there's minimal chance of rotting. I did a rough and quick evaluation of what I consider my favorites, and I may end up changing a few, but the main consideration I did was heavy flaking. The larger the trait, the better. and I did my best to not select those that have miniature spines and more rounded Astrophytum. There are this one has a star shape where it has those curved in ribs, and I may still end up changing some, but this is pretty much the best that I selected. There's some nice ones here, but again, I don't like so much spines, and I prefer more rounded Astrophytum. But in any case, I have 4 planters now, and now I'll be working on trimming back the tap roots. So I'll be cutting back until where my finger is right here. It'll probably be just maybe 1 or 2 centimeters, and I'll do that with everything, and I'll allow it to air dry for the entire day. I'll leave it upside down for an entire day before placing it into its final spot. And that's pretty much it. Just a very rough cut. I'll leave the thicker part of the taproot, and then I'll let this air dry upside down. This one has a much thicker taproot, so I'll leave it a bit longer, and I'll manually remove the finer roots. So even with very jagged roots or rocks for the substrate, I had fairly minimal flesh damage. There were a few that the rocks pretty much embedded itself into the body, but I didn't have any rot issues or anything. So for me, this is the perfect substrate. I can water as often or as infrequent as I want. And even in the wintertime, I water my collection. I just cut back dramatically. But substrate works great for me. And I would imagine only in desert regions would it actually be bad, since the soil already evaporates fairly quickly because of the heat and low humidity in desert regions. But for more tropical or even more mild regions, I think for some cacti, not all of them, but for some cacti, a pure gravel substrate works fine. It's very cheap. I got mine bulk from construction supply chain, and they even have different grades for the sizes. Mine is grade 0. It's the most commonly used grade, but there's finer and thicker grades as well. So with these thicker taproots, I'll leave them a bit longer than the shorter ones. And yeah, that's how I do it. Everyone has different preferences, but that's pretty much it. If you have rooting powder, you can obviously dust the roots You can also use sulfur to heal the cut. Air drying will work fine for me, but you know your own climate and your issues you have with humidity and whatever. But yeah. Here's the final result. These are my top picks. This is the secondary better traits, third quality, and these are the more inferior common Astrophytum. So I'll keep them with their roots upwards like this for maybe 1 or 2 days, and then I'll proceed to making a small indentation in the soil and then placing them into the substrate. I won't water these for the rest of the month. We're already halfway through, and April I'll just proceed to watering as usual. Like I mentioned, we're still in the growing season. We're about to start fall, so it will slow down a bit, but I just won't water heavily as I did before. Just a top spray, and yeah, this is how I have decided to do proceeding with my Astrophytum. I'm going to trim the roots of my Geocalcium, and I'll probably check the Lophophora as well. They don't need to be repot right now, but since I'm already doing this work, I'll do those as well. Like I mentioned, most of my cacti are in pure gravel, and that includes the Geocalcium. They did take a little while to actually take off, but once they're rooted, they grew quite well. Some of these are getting quite large, so I'll space them out a little bit. Let's see, if this was in a smaller planter, it would have already filled the container. So these are nice forms. They're still low to the ground and they're just getting wider. And these I'll also trim back the roots the same way I did the Astrophytum. There's no taproot on these, but there's a slightly thicker root near the top, but it'll be trimmed in a similar manner to the Astrophytum that I did before. And I want to check out how the cresseted and here's the cresseted one. And this one I'll trim a minimal amount of roots since it didn't develop very well, but the colors are quite nice. And I like how this one's coming out. I'll keep this on its own roots. I'll probably give it its own container as well. See if it grows a little better. And I'll be checking on the Lophophoras as well when I get around to it. And I want to see if the mimosa root extract, besides causing excessive pupping, I want to see if it changes any of the root growth pattern. Since the DMT structure is similar to IAA hormone, there may be a chance that it increases the rooting or something. And this one is the only Geocalcium that actually became variegated, and looks nice. So most of them I have them listed as variegated, but they're just the common type. Whoa, these are nice. And this is a different type of geocalcium. These are quite different root system. They have a nice taproot. I have 2 of these grafted, and this was the only one on its own roots. And for some reason, they just didn't want to grow as well, since I'm a bit rough on seedlings. And to trim, like I mentioned, it'll be very similar to the Astrophytum. I'll leave maybe 2 or 3 centimeters at the top. I'll then allow these to dry and remove if there's any rotting flesh or roots. Just remove them. And yeah, I'll do it the same way as I did the Astrophytum. I'll leave it root side up so it dries better, calluses, and then I'll place them in their spot. So I constantly reuse the same substrate. Since they're just rocks, it's very unlikely they will carry any pathogens or anything. So I simply reuse it. I remove most of the roots, but there's always a few that stay behind. And yeah, this is how they turned out. I left maybe 2 centimeters. I'll leave them root side up. And spread them out a bit. I also cut the taproot geocalcium since I don't have a deep planter, or I don't want to make one for it. I'll just leave it like this and I'll plant it the same way. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I'll be checking on the Lophophora next. So it'll stay like this for maybe 2 or 3 days, just like the Astrophytum, and I'll pot them correctly. And these 2 will get their own container. And let's see if I can squeeze in the 3 Astrophytum that did not make the cut. And this one stay here. No, I'll just plant that with some Trichocereus or something. And then yeah, that's good. I wasn't planning on trimming these roots, but I'll just get around to it. So these were part of the Lophophora experiment. These controls, they did not pup, or at least we'll see if they didn't. And this one I tried to induce sunburn, but it didn't. It just compacted in growth. These 2 are dividers, as are these, so these don't count. And you can see that there were deaths on the treatments with the mimosa root bark extract. There were 2 more here and then another here. But those that were treated, they for the most part had pupping as a side effect. I did have deaths around 60% maybe, but this was from 21 days of application, or 27, and these were 4 applications 1 week apart. This was a different chemical treatment for these, and only this one shows the large pupping, and it's hard to tell so far, but it looks like this one is possibly going to be cresseted, but it's still too early to tell. So I want to see how the root system developed on these, and I'll trim these as well. Here's the largest treatment, nothing special with the roots. And here's another. This one is much thicker, but nothing too extraordinary about it. So the pups are in subterranean flesh, and these weren't pupping from damage to the apex, but rather pupping on the actual trait. So nothing too special, at least that I can tell. Here's the divider. And these are all Texicana or Texasis. They're not the pupping variety, but the treatments seem to have induced that growth pattern. This one's stalling quite a lot. And these were the same application but lower rates, lower frequency. The pupping is a bit different on this one with a lot of treatments. It seems to have pupped strangely at this section here, but who knows. So there's no special effect on the actual root growth, despite the structure of the compound being similar. Yeah, these are pupping normally. This is another split control, or a divider from a different treatment. And the controls. So the controls have very normal growth pattern, nothing special about it. Some are slightly thicker taproots than others, but that's not unique or anything. This one was trying to induce the sunburn, but it didn't occur. And yeah, the rest are just normal Lophophoras. So these are just about 3 years, if not just over it. They're very small since I don't fertilize often, and they're in 100% gravel. So I'll be trimming these. I Don't really plan on keeping them separate anymore. Only this one, since it has the most unique growth pattern so far. But these are all fine for me. And since these don't show any different growth pattern, I'll just put them in with the rest. This one's a nice color though. So like with the Astrophytum, I do leave a larger portion of the thicker taproot, but I tend to cut quite dramatically and then just remove the feeder roots. So in this case I could cut this taproot, but since it's fairly thick, it's not going to be a big issue. And that's how I trim it back. With this one, which is the one that has lots of puffing. If it's hard to see the taproot, just remove the feeder roots so you don't accidentally cut in excess. And this is with Lophophora, since they root fairly quickly. It's not a big issue cutting back. With Ariocarpus or other slow rooters, you should cut back less than with these other cacti. So this is good. And again, if you have any rooting powder or sulfur, you can add it to the cut end and help with callousing. So there isn't really a metric, at least that I know of, to know how much to cut back or not. Just know that the smaller the button, it will take a bit longer for it to regenerate and start growing again. So you can be a bit more aggressive with larger plants, but it's really up to the grower. If I had an unlimited amount of grow space, I would get really deep planters or even a garbage bin, and then just leave it like a meter deep taproot. That would be pretty awesome. So most of these just have one taproot, so it's going to be really easy to just cut back. Just removing, and you can see there's no rot and no real skin damage, despite it being in a very coarse, jagged rock substrate. And just like the others, I'll leave this maybe 2 or 3 days with their roots exposed so it calluses, and then I'll plant them, and I will not water for the rest of the month. These could easily go far longer without watering, and I'll just go by what the weather shows. If we're still having fairly hot weather, I'll just water it in 2 weeks. If not, I can wait a month and start with the regular watering. And my scissors are just common paper cutting scissors. If you have a scalpel, it would be better, since I kind of crush the roots rather than cutting them. Here, I'll actually cut more. And a scalpel would be a much cleaner cut. And I'd actually suggest that over using a normal pair of scissors. But in general, I don't have much issues. These scissors are fairly sharp, so it's not too big of an issue. So I have some dried Lophophora roots from a while back. I think I still have them saved. I'm collecting them just to see if it's worthwhile, especially those with larger collections, to attempt an extraction on these. If you use a more compost substrate, it might not be worthwhile. But since mine is just rocks, I don't see any issues with possible bacteria infections or anything. And yeah, that's pretty easy. So here they are. I'll be saving these roots. And these were degrafts that still have not really started rooting, but some of them have root nubs coming out. I'll place these rocks back since I always reuse it, and I'll see what else I might. Actually, you know what? I'm going to just do my entire collection, and I'll also do the Ariocarpus just to show how you shouldn't cut back as much. And here are my larger Ariocarpus. And these are the Lophophoras from the proof of concept harvesting style. So it's been approximately 2 years since I did a root trimming. So let's see how the roots are doing. This was a degraft, and wow, the root took really well. So you can clearly see it was degrafted, and basically just one side decided to root. So here you can see it. One of the taproots actually rotted, completely rotted, but there isn't really much damage to the Lophophora or the taproot. There's some dead flesh. I'll pull this back a little bit and clean it up, but it was pretty interesting to see an entire leg basically rotted off. And these are the same species. The diffusa, very characteristic bloated head, smaller root system. It's another diffuser, very fat head. This is the control for the proof of concept harvesting. The taproot is quite fat now. Remember, most of these had a trimming maybe 2 years back. This is the harvested Lophophora. The taproot was already very small during that experiment. You can see. But the head, the head is practically the same size in terms of the height, and in diameter the uncut is larger, but you cannot really tell that this was harvested. If you look at any other unharvested cactus, it's indistinguishable. This damage here is not from the cut, but the actual soil line. These are the controls and the experiment. This is another degraft. This one took a very long time to root. This is, I think, a Frizii, and it's growing quite nice. You can see there's an empty space here since it was degraft, but I could easily cut this off and they would look like they were own roots. There's some soil here. I'll keep this as a cluster. And here are the Ariocarpus. So much smaller taproot than I expected, but they are quite fat. And when I cut this back, I won't cut back as dramatically. I'll just cut the tips of the taproots. So you can kind of see here where the previous cut was, since it's kind of flat and then there's a large difference. I'll just cut back maybe, I'll cut and leave only maybe 1 centimeter of the new root intact. I think this one is my only Frillius, the traditional Ariocarpus. And yeah, these are already slow growing, and they're even slower in my collection. But what's the rush? This one's the largest. Let's see how the taproot is. Yeah, this one's very fat. Very thick taproot. And it does make sense since the crown is much larger. And for the taproots of the Ariocarpus, like I mentioned, you don't want to cut back as dramatically. I think that was enough for the Ariocarpus. And I'll cut back a little more. Since Ariocarpus are much slower growing, too much of a cutback would just hinder its growth like tremendously, so you don't need to cut back as much. But do remove the feeder roots that are right there. also gives this a wash. Basically just trim back the tips. Sorry for the poor camera angle. So the cut back, you can see I'm not cutting back a large amount, basically just the tips so that it encourages new roots to form out and not just grow the root tip. So I don't know why there's actually soil in this substrate. I'll wash back quite a bit of this soil since I don't like it too much. And yeah, and then for the Lophophoras, same deal as the others. You can cut back a bit more aggressive, and it should be completely fine. Here's the trimmed mammillaria. and the is buoy. So when replanting the cacti that I trimmed the roots back, since my substrate is 100% mineral soil, just gravel, the hole won't stay in place. So I try to make a hole with a Sharpie, and then I place it and remove the Sharpie at the same time. And usually it's harder with one hand, but I just place it on top of the soil. I don't need to bury it too deeply. With the drought period of around a month, this cactus will compact a bit and it'll try to rescind into the soil. And at least in my experience, most of them will automatically go into the soil without having to actually bury them under the soil line. So I'll be doing that with all of them. With this planter, it was fairly easy since there's less cacti. I'll have the most trouble with this one since there's quite a lot of seedlings, and due to the soil composition, it's a bit harder to place them into the substrate as organized as I want. But yeah, that's basically it. These are 2 days after trimming. Everything's fairly calloused. There was some rot on some, but it's already fairly well healed. And here are the roots for the Astrophytum. There seems to be some sort of oxidation or something, since it's fairly red. There's a slight smell to these. It's kind of like I think the best description would be wet soil. I spread them out and I pull them and mix them every once in a while to see if I can dry it without having any rot issues or mold or anything. And there's a fair amount here. We'll see if I can extract anything. I'll test if it's active at small doses, and maybe just reapply it on some cacti to see if there's any effect whatsoever. So I finished potting up all of the other trimmed roots cacti, and the only ones I'm not going to repot right now after 2 days is the older Lophophora and Ariocarpus. It's not that there's any issues with the roots or anything, it's that I washed the substrate to remove some organic soil, some topsoil that I had, and the substrate's still wet, so I spread it out a bit, and I'll wait as long as it takes so that it's dry while I repot it. So they're a bit thicker than I originally anticipated. I guess it's because it was partially under the substrate, but it looks pretty nice, pretty healthy. The roots are healthy. Here's a comparison between the trimmed proof of concept harvesting and the control. Like I mentioned before, if you look at the original video, the taproot on this one was already larger to begin with, so it isn't 100% fair comparison, but you can see the effects after almost 2 years now, a year and a half I think, and it's undetectable that it was harvested before. The flesh, it compacts, and it just becomes subterranean flesh afterwards. You can see here, there's practically no difference. There's still a line division between the subterranean flesh, which becomes compact, the crown, and the root, taproot. I was considering just harvesting this one as well, since I already uprooted it and everything, but I remembered I want to see the development of the root of the flower to see if there's a large delay on harvesting the flesh. This one does seem more mature at the apex, so when this flowers, I will harvest it and then see if it affects future flowering, if it delays it more than a year or so. In the case of a traditional crown harvest where you cut it, there's a delay, since it'll basically restart with a new head. And the rest look nice. These diffusa are very fat, particularly this one. Very, very large fat head. And it's this size even in 100% mineral soil. And the colusi, I removed that rotted flesh, the rotted section from the taproot, and it looks ugly now. It looks like it's rotting, but I think this is just oxidation. But in any case, I'll leave these roots exposed. See, this one didn't have any issues and it still turned this orange red rust color, but it's not any damage, I think. I'll leave these exposed to the air and just drying out more until the soil dries out completely, so I can repot safely. And originally I was gonna start watering after 2 weeks, but I think I'll just leave it for a month or so until they actually compact a bit. I want the cactus to what is the term? To retract into the soil a bit. Here's the head. I don't know if it's variegated or not, since it's still too early. And the possible cresseted head, and the monstrous Lophophora that was treated with mimosa extract, as were these. So yeah, I repotted these. These caused the most trouble, since the gravel trips are quite large in comparison to the seedlings. So every time I place one and then start moving the substrate to place another, it moves everything around. But I got around to it. Hopefully I don't have a large die-off on these. The minima, they sometimes have a high die-off rate when repotting. And the mimosa, I had 3 tiny seedlings that I was planning on grafting, and for some reason I couldn't locate them, and now I'm down 3, but that's fine. I still have 6 seedlings on their own roots. They're still very small, but they're chugging along. And the Astrophytum were fairly easy to repot.